What I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about the Battle of Princeton itself, and I'm certain that most of folks on the call here, I've seen a lot of names I recognize and many I don't, are at least familiar with the battle. The hope for today is to tell you about how the interpretation of the battle has changed over the course of 250 years, what has caused those changes, and how we intend to present the Battle of Princeton today, if you had come to visit the park. Um, I titled it "The Day Is Ours," which is also the title of a book about the 10 crucial days in the Battle of Princeton. I like that phrase, "The day is ours." It appears in not one, not two, but three separate primary source accounts of the Battle of Princeton, attributed to three different gentlemen, Colonel Cadwalader, General Mercer, and of course General Washington. So we'll get into that in a minute as it comes to primary sources, but I do like that line, "The day is ours." Let's see here. There we go. So I'll start with the challenges of interpreting a battle that's 250 years old. There may be some folks on here. We've recently made friends across the seas with our colleagues over at Culloden Battlefield, which, for those of you who are familiar with the war, will know that there are a lot of characters at the Battle of Culloden on both sides who will show up in the American War for Independence, not the least of which is, of course, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer. But for those who have battles that are older than 250 years old, these challenges will seem minute, they'll seem small, but for us, telling the story of something that happened in the grand scheme of history, not really that long ago, there are still a lot of challenges that we face. And I've listed the three that I personally feel make the biggest challenge for us here at Princeton. The first is, of course, primary source material. This is the golden egg for all historic interpretation, hearing it from the mouths of people who actually experienced what we consider history, but for them was just life. And just like us, their memories are fallible. And we get that when we read the primary source information from this battle. I'll get into it a little more as we get further into the presentation, but it is both a blessing and a curse sometimes using primary source information. The second is what we call felt history. This is a term that we use in the field of public history that essentially describes how people, us today, remember and recall and cherish our history. Different people see our history in different ways, and a lot of that has to do with their own personal histories, their personal and political affiliations, their genealogy. You have folks here in the United States who can trace their ancestors all the way back to this battle, and we love talking to those folks, but those people sometimes have a different feeling about or remembering of this battle than others do. And that's a challenge as well when it comes to secondary and tertiary sources for material. And the last, of course, is the easiest to explain of all, and that's the passage of time. That doesn't just affect the people and their sources, but perhaps the most difficult thing for us here at Princeton is it affects the ground itself. Telling this story is increasingly difficult the farther away from the battle we get, mostly because Princeton, like many other American Revolutionary War battlefields, has been developed on all sides. The park itself is only about 85 acres today and surrounded on all sides by public and private buildings, housing, residentials, and of course our neighbors, the Institute for Advanced Study and Princeton University. So all of these present challenges to interpretation. But it's never stopped anyone from trying to interpret the battle nearly since day one. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that changed. This is, again, our first struggle, primary source material. I've got three quotes for you there. Hopefully you can read them well enough on your screens, but I'll read them out loud for you. The first comes from Captain Thomas Rodney of the Philadelphia Light Infantry. He mentions that the 3rd Division of the Continental Army is composed of General Mercer's brigade with troops of about 300 men. The next comes from a British source, Lieutenant William Hale of the 45th Regiment of Foot, who says that that same body of troops was over 800 men. The last comes from Sergeant James McMichaels of Miles, Pennsylvania Regiment, who says that that same number of troops was only about 120. So you can see off the bat that all three of these men who were present for the Battle of Princeton, in a moment that I'll talk about when we get into the battle, all have different recollections of how many people were on the field and how the turn of events transpired over the course of what was really a less than 2-hour battle. And you may think that in the moment, it's easy to, take note of these things, but I think anybody who, in the call may have had combat experience before won't take for granted the amount of adrenaline pumping through your body when you're going through an event like this. Every single primary source that we have from this battle, and frankly, any battle of the American Revolution, always has to be taken with a grain of salt, because these men didn't write this down as it was happening. They wrote it down later, and their memories have been altered by not only time, but also perhaps post-traumatic stress. We tend to look at the American Revolution sometimes in a very sanitized way, but I hope to impart on you, certainly by the end of this, that this battle was a battle, and that people were brutally, brutally killed and wounded over fighting over what was essentially open fields in an apple orchard. On the right there, you'll see one of the great pieces of primary source material that we have, and this one's good because it comes to us from before the battle. Those of you who are scholars and armchair historians of the American Revolution may recognize that. It's what we call the Cadwalader Spy Map, allegedly drawn up by a student of the College of New Jersey, today Princeton University. It was given to Colonel Cadwalader and then to General Washington sometime between the First Battle of Trenton and the Second Battle of Trenton. Using this map, Washington is going to come up with the idea of attacking Princeton. And for the sake of time, I'll expedite the first 9 of the 10 crucial days when we get to retelling the story of the battle. But suffice to say, this map is a pretty good indication of primary source material. The map can't change. However, the young man who drew it may have missed a few things. Those of you who are local to the area may look at this map and find it somewhat confusing. It indicates at least one recognizable feature, which is to say modern-day Route 206, what is today Quaker Bridge Road or Quaker Road, depending on what part of the road you're on, and then an unknown road, a back road, what will become later known as the Sawmill Road. Interpretation of this battle kicks off literally from the mouths of people who fought there. Major James Wilkinson, who some of you on the call may recognize the name for his later works as one of the earliest traitors to the United States. Certainly, if you ask the Aaron Burr folks, they may think so. But he, in the aftermath of his golden years, went around and revisited his old stomping grounds when he served as a major in Washington's army. He's here for the Battle of Princeton, and he writes a fairly complete recounting of what happened, including these maps. This is one of the earliest maps of the battlefield that we have, if not the earliest map of the battlefield. It's sanitized and includes the addition of what is today Mercer Road, which was not here at the time of the battle. It's built in 1807. It's an interesting map. It's a little linear, but it gives us a lot of the key features that sound in various other sources. You have down on the bottom a tree plot there. It says A next to B, which is the Quaker Meeting House. Just slightly above that is number 7, which is Thomas Clark's house, and then directly across that is number 6, which is William Clark's house. It's a good approximation of the battle. There's one thing missing from it, and that is any evidence of that back road. You can see a vague dotted line here where it says B, indicating where Wilkinson may have believed that it was. Later in the 19th century, you get the 2 great recountings of the battle. The first comes from Lossing's Pictorial Field Guide of the American Revolution, which you see on the right. The second is from Stryker. In the late 19th century, Stryker essentially writes what is to be the mother of all books about the 10 crucial days. The problem with Stryker is that he has no sources for his sources in his book. And so while he was certainly able to interview the children and grandchildren of folks who had actually experienced the 10 crucial days, we have to take everything he wrote in that book with a fairly big grain of salt. That said, those maps haven't changed too much. They indicate that back road, again, somewhat undefined, as well as what is today Route 206, marked there on Stryker's map as the old road to Trenton, and the general approximation of where these troops entered the battlefield. And that's really the major change as we move forward into the 20th and 21st century, is where are these roads and how did these people get there? At the top of that list comes at the turn of the 21st century with the discovery of, or at least the semi-discovery of, what's known as the Sawmill Road. I know a lot of folks here were probably well involved and on the level when this broke out. Essentially, make a long story short, the property next door to the battlefield was owned by the Institute for Advanced Study. They were going to build a series of faculty housing on a piece of ground that was at least somewhat known to be part of the battlefield. What unfolded was a long and nasty legal battle that made a lot of enemies and not too many friends here in Princeton, but ultimately was brought to a head with the arrival of formerly known as the Civil War Trust, today known as the American Battlefield Trust. Well, that fight's behind us, but what came out of it was a series of incredibly useful pieces of information, the least of which was the rough and archaeological traces of these roadways, two in particular, which have reshaped how we interpret the battle. The first is the Sawmill Road, which may, as you see on the map to the left, swing much lower than we originally had thought along the canal, or rather the Stony Brook, just north of the canal. And the other is a kind of newly discovered lane, which we've dubbed Clark Lane. Those of you who are locals or Friends, Society of Friends will recognize that lane. It runs just north of the Quaker Meeting and comes right along the front of Thomas Clark's house, which is where, if you visit us here at the battlefield, you can take a tour of the home. It's the only surviving witness structure on the battlefield still standing today. Now you can see on this next slide, that these roads intersect. They don't look quite right. You'll see in a minute kind of our reimagining of what those roads look like. And I'd like to preface before we get into the battle itself that research is ongoing. We have a lot of really, really great things in the works right now, including a 15.5-acre ongoing archaeological project headed by Wade Katz, looking for the evidence of these roads. So we're really looking forward to what we find in the future, and hopefully we can get a concrete answer as to where these roads ran, how wide they were, and their use during and after the battle. The big quote that came to us from research was this one here, and this kind of threw a wrench in a lot of the 19th century retelling of the battle, which is to say, this comes from a gentleman named Captain Rodney from the Philadelphia Light Infantry. He says that Mercer's brigade, which was headed by Colonel Hazlitt of Delaware on foot and General Mercer on horseback, was to march straight on to Princeton without turning to the right or left. Well, as we'll see as these armies approach, there really, in most 19th century interpretations, were only the two roads, the Sawmill Road and the King's Highway, today Route 206. The addition of a third road, the Clark Lane, does perhaps add some weight behind Rodney's account of how the three columns of Washington's army were divided. But as you see, we've sort of drawn out here, kind of a scoped out from that one image you saw in the last slide, what those roads might have looked like at the time of the battle. And again, we have a lot of research ongoing that may change these. So come give us a call next week and maybe I'll have a different answer for you. But for the moment, this is our understanding of what the ground looks like at the time of the battle. Recent archaeology and primary sources have given us some great new insights as to, one, the validity of certain primary source materials, and two, the placement of troops on the battlefield. Again, you can take a look and read if you're on a computer wide enough, but we have three quotes here from three different gentlemen in the Continental Army, all of whom talk about the British artillery firing over the heads of the American troops. And at first, I like to joke, one person is telling a story. Two people say the same thing, and it's a coincidence. If you have three or more people writing about the same thing, there's a good bet that it actually happened. And you can see on the right there from our recent archaeological dig, you may have seen, we got a little press about it recently. We found 34 pieces of artillery shot on the backside of the hill, which is a direct proof of that these three men, at the very least, weren't telling tall tales. The British were indeed firing high, and I'll tell you why in just a second. The Battle of Princeton took place on the morning of January 3rd, 1777. It's the third and final battle in what will become known as the 10 Crucial Days campaign. 9 days earlier, Washington risks it all, and a force of about 2,400 men will cross the Delaware River and attack the Hessian garrison in Trenton, winning a stunning victory and throwing the Crown forces in New Jersey in disarray. Several days later, Washington's back on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River with additional reinforcements and lures the British into a second battle on January 2nd, 1777, known as the Second Battle of Trenton or the Battle of Assunpink Creek. Washington successfully stops the British from being able to cross said creek and bogs them down into a prolonged artillery duel and bloody slaughter on the bridge over the creek. By the evening of January 2nd, Washington faces a difficult decision, which is to say whether or not he should stay. One of my favorite stories to come from this council of war that he holds before the inevitable march out of the battlefield is that General Arthur Sinclair, one of Washington's younger brigadier commanders, suggests, possibly at the behest of the general himself, that it would be prudent to disengage from the enemy and strike them where they least expect it, Princeton, or perhaps even better, New Brunswick. General Hugh Mercer, General Washington's longtime friend, they fought in the French and Indian War together, where they became acquainted. Eventually, Washington convinces Mercer to move to Fredericksburg, Virginia, to buy his boyhood home on the Ferry Farm. These two men were very close. And in this moment, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer does something rather ostentatious for the period. He takes his fist and he slams it on the table, which doesn't seem like anything to us in the 21st century, but for folks back then, that's a pretty flagrant show of emotion, especially for officers, people who were of the gentry, so to speak. Mercer is in agreement. This is the perfect way to continue the campaign and to keep spirits high. Washington agrees, and very shortly, the rest of the staff agree, and so by midnight on January 2nd into January 3rd, the entire Continental Army is disengaging from the line and marching up a series of back roads. Towards that back road you saw drawn on the Cadwallader spy map. They're led by local guides and pass through frozen ground. At the time, that area is known as the Great Bear Swamp. Today, it's mostly Hamilton Township and bits of Robbinsville. As the Army marches up in the dark, they are able to do so because of the serious drop in temperature. What was an unseasonably warm January 2nd and 1st turned into a deep, deep freeze. Major Wilkinson gives us a beautiful picture when he says that the roads had turned hard as if they were pavement. Meanwhile, on the other side of the creek, Lord Charles Cornwallis doesn't listen to the advice of his fellow officers, and indeed doesn't listen to the advice of pickets that are sending up the alarm that something's happening on the other side of the creek, and is resolved to attack Washington, where he sits in Trenton in the morning. Before he goes to bed, however, he dispatches a letter to the commander of the 4th Brigade, currently situated in Princeton, just up the road. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood. Mahood, just over 40 years old, is in command of about 1,100 troops. His own 17th Regiment of Foot, the 55th Regiment of Foot, the 40th Regiment of Foot, and a handful of convalescents, not to mention 4 6-pounder guns and 2 companies of His Majesty's 16th Light Dragoons. Mahood is ordered by Cornwallis to bring the British baggage train south from Princeton to Trenton for what Cornwallis believes on the morning of January 3rd is going to be the final battle of the American Revolution. And just here for your own edification is the breakdown of forces as Washington approached the southern crossing of the Stony Brook on the morning of January 3rd. For those of you who are students of the Revolution and know this story a little well, you may realize that there's a name missing from this column, and that's, of course, General Nathaniel Greene. Greene is here at Princeton, although he'll write surprisingly little about it. I couldn't tell you where he was on the battlefield or in what capacity he was leading these troops. We just know that after literally 2 days before Washington reorganizing the structure of the army, on the fly, he reorganizes it again on the literally moments away from battle. He splits his 2-divisioned army into 3 separate columns, the first under the command of General John Sullivan, the second under the command of Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, and the third under the command of Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin. Somewhere in here is General Greene. On the other side, I've given you already Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood, commanding the 4th Brigade. This is the breakdown of his forces, but make no mistake, this is a motley crew of British troops here. You have well-seasoned regulars as well as new recruits, men who are sick or recovering from being sick. This is an interesting brigade, and it was placed here in Princeton for a reason, to protect the baggage train and to avoid having to issue more fighting for these troops. Most of these men served quite valiantly during the New York campaign and had suffered as a result. To give you an idea of our ground here, here's your Google Earth view with all of the relative locations. Again, those of you who are local may recognize a few of these places. Top of the screen there is what's known at the time as the Post Road or the King's Highway. That's modern-day Route 206 for you Princeton dwellers and Mercer County folk. You've definitely driven on that road once or twice, I'm certain of it. Farther down, the little green dots represent buildings that we know are here at the time of the battle, folks who owned them, and of course the corresponding roadways that would have been here at the time of the fighting. At roughly 7:30 in the morning on January 3rd, 1777, General Washington divides his column and begins marching them up the several roadways. General Sullivan, as you saw, is to take the Sawmill Road. Sullivan's troops are the hammer, the anvil, rather, of Washington's army. This is the meat and potatoes troops, you New England men, Virginia men, Pennsylvania men. They are the long-term veterans of Washington's army. Following behind, taking again that middle road, is General Mercer with his own brigade of veteran riflemen, along with the newly added brigade under the command of Colonel John Cadwalader, nearly 1,100 or 1,300 troops, Philadelphia militia, known as the Philadelphia Associated Brigade. Bringing up the rear there is General Mifflin. Mifflin has orders to capture and destroy the bridge over the Stony Brook at the intersection of the Quaker Road and Route 206. As you just saw, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood's force crossed that bridge long before Mifflin got there. In the rising sun, Maud sees the sun glinting off of metal. We think he catches eyes on the back end of Sullivan's column as they march out of the trees south of the Quaker meeting and proceed across the Sawmill Road, the open fields belonging to Thomas and William Clark and David Olden. Mahood quickly doubles back, and Mercer is ordered to take possession of high ground to stop what they imagined at the time was only a handful of cavalry, of dragoons on that hill, from getting back to town. It's important to remember as the battle goes on that General Washington will, until the last possible moment, believe that the British garrison is still in Princeton. As the day develops quickly, Mercer crosses the open ground of Thomas and William Clark's farms into an apple orchard. When he arrives, he sees a line of British troops facing against him. It's a picket line of the 17th Regiment of Foot. The picket line is quickly dispatched. They rush back down the north face of the hill and then return in force with their 4 additional 6-pounder guns, flanked on either side by light dragoons. Washington, marching with General Sullivan, orders Sullivan's troops to stay where they are. It's confusing at first. Who are these people on the other side of the hill? What are they doing there? And what is their intention? It becomes clear, painfully clear, almost immediately. Mercer's brigade numbered fewer than 350 men, and accompanied by 2 3-pounder guns, Mercer didn't have much of a chance standing up against the near 700 or 800 troops under Mahood's command. The fighting in the apple orchard behind William Clark's farmhouse was quick. Several volleys of fire back and forth at a range that according to some primary sources, was as few as 25 to 40 yards away, is near murder with these weapons. Add the artillery on both sides, and you've got a pretty substantial killing field. It comes as no surprise that only a few moments into this fighting, Mawhood orders his troops to fix bayonets and charges into the orchard. When he does, it's timed somewhat poorly with the falling of General Mercer's horse. He's struck either in the hoof or in the chest, and the horse goes down, taking Mercer with him. When Mercer tries to stand, the British are already charging into the orchard. He's struck in the head as he's trying to stand back up. He's surrounded, allegedly, as one story goes, by British grenadiers. Those grenadiers call him to surrender. They say, "Call for quarter, you damned rebel." Mercer responds that, "I am no rebel." And for that, he's stabbed 7 times in the chest and the abdomen and left for dead. Things go from bad to worse for the Continental Army as Mercer's troops run directly into the advancing forces of Colonel Cadwalader, who fire a few volleys before also fleeing behind the safety of the hill. Washington, hearing the sound of what started as a small skirmish turn very quickly into a full conflagration of battle, sends his troops scurrying back across the fields of David Olden and William Clark to rush into the left flank of the British line. This is where we have this fantastic moment of General Washington riding between the lines, waving his sword. He shouts to his men, "Parade with me, my brave fellows. There are but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." As the story goes, Washington disappears in a cloud of smoke as men from both sides fire, but appears unharmed as he marches through the other side. Washington quickly rushed back to where Cadwalader had taken his troops, and finding that Cadwalader had managed to reorder his men, probably a surprise for General Washington, who up to this point had never seen militia reform in any kind of way, orders Cadwalader to return his and Mercer's troops to the line. As they do, the arrival of the third and final column under the command of General Mifflin adds considerable strain to Mawhood's defense of the hill. Mawhood is now fighting outnumbered at least 4 or 5 to 1. As you can see, he's nearly surrounded on 3 sides, and his repeated calls for the 55th Regiment of Foot just up the hill from him to the northeast have gone unanswered, largely because General Sullivan has sent General Scott to take care of business. And as they say, the 55th disappear without firing a shot, fleeing back towards town. After almost 45 minutes of fighting, Mawhood is now well and truly alone and outnumbered considerably. Sometime during the fighting, Mawhood begins to order a general withdrawal. As he does, Washington's men pounce at the opportunity. I like this moment, and I'm biased, of course, but this is the first time since the war began that General Washington and the Continental Army was able to push British troops off the field. General Washington is alleged to have turned to soldiers nearby and said, "It's a fine day for a fox chase, my lads." In town, the last regiment standing, the 40th Regiment of Foot, puts up a decent fight just along a small rivulet known as Frog Hollow. For my locals, that's the Springdale Golf Course. After a brief fight on the back 9, the 40th rush off to take cover wherever they can, most of them to the veritable stone fortress of Nassau Hall. Nassau Hall at the time was the tallest building in colonial North America, and with British soldiers firing from windows and doors, General Sullivan orders recently promoted Brigadier General Henry Knox to draw up his artillery and level the building to the ground. Before he can, however, the British soldiers inside wave a white dining table cloth out of the second story of the structure, and with minimal damage done, the 40th Regiment of Foot surrenders, bringing the Battle of Princeton to a close. And if you think it was fast, you're right. This battle lasts less than 2 hours. It's remarkably quick for the 18th century. And a lot of that has to do with the fact, first, that it's a meeting engagement. And second, that the number of troops involved. Washington has a significant numerical advantage over his enemy. And in a rapidly developing meeting engagement, essentially an ongoing game of chess, Washington was able to outposition and outgun his opponent. I like to point folks' attention to these 3 quotes in the aftermath of the battle. Now, a lot of this is for not just Princeton, but the whole 10 crucial days. The first is from General Howe, who at this point in the war was banking on trying to get the local population to turn the tide of the war. Instead, after Trenton and Princeton, Howe is brutally aware of the fact that he is now going to have to face Washington and destroy him outright in the field. More on that in later 1777. The next comes from a member of Congress from Virginia, Thomas Nelson, writing in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He writes that the tables have turned. We caught these scoundrels by surprise. The last is my favorite, comes from a loyalist writer named Nicholas Creswell. Creswell writes in his state of Virginia, the minds of the people are much altered. Their late successes have turned the scale, and now they are all liberty mad again. My absolute favorite line from the 10 Crucial Days, and it comes from a loyalist. So what about today? What about the legacy of our battlefield today? Thanks in large part, as Bob mentioned at the beginning, with our joint cooperation between the DEP, the Princeton Battlefield Society, our officially recognized friends organization, and the American Battlefield Trust, we have big things happening at the battlefield. This is a sketch of a possible new look that the battlefield may have in the coming years as we approach the 250th. The top of that list is what we call rehabilitation. Since there are no pictures of what the battle looked like at the time, we have to use our best guess, which is why the archaeology we're doing and the research we're doing at the Clark House is so important. We'll restore what we can, knowing from pictures that existed in the 19th century, and we're going to revitalize what we do here at the park. It's not just about building a bigger and more spacious park. It's about bringing this field to life and showing people what it was like here during, before, and after the battle. This includes new signage. This is a nice sneak peek for folks who are watching. You can expect to see these showing up on the field before the end of the year. So if you come visit us for our annual reenactment next January, you'll get to see a whole slew of new signage just like this. We're improving on living history here at the park. Front center there is a nice shot of myself and Office of Historic Sites Director Mark Texel burning that foul British tea. We were actually the first site in New Jersey to celebrate a 250th event. This is the 250th anniversary of the Princeton Tea Party, which followed the more famous Boston Tea Party. So in summary, the interpretation of this battlefield has changed exponentially over 250 years. There's, of course, no doubt that it would. And every day we discover new things. We have an ongoing archival project taking place at the battlefield. My great coworkers, Hannah Lee and Mackenzie Tansey, if you ever see them, give them a round of applause. They're the best coworkers anyone could ask for, have found some incredible stuff in the archives of the Clark House that have changed our idea of what the farm looked like at the time of the battle. Our hope is that you come to visit us, even if it's not just for the 250th and beyond. What we're looking to do here is something totally new for the state of New Jersey, and we're really looking forward to what we can get done with the state, with our private and public partners. So John, if there are any questions, please fire away.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. Well, that was just fantastic. I learned so much that I did not know, and just really something. I'm going to ask as soon as I figure out how to do it. I'm going to ask John Fabiano to unmute and share with us questions that have come in the chat, and then we'll unmute everybody for Q&A. There we go. John, are you?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
I think the first item we have is from Carl Barna, and he made a comment about it would be nice to have the Swan collection assembled all in one place. The other notable quote, the quote that we'll refer to about the, I believe it's the day of ours, Peter Primavera said that's from Shakespeare's Henry V.
Yes.
And therefore, all three primary sources would have known the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Carl Barna again asks about the flags on the display of the regiments. I believe it's the American regiments. I don't remember what that image looked like, but the flags themselves.
This one here.
Yes, that one.
That's called the Grand Union flag. The Betsy Ross flag, as we'll come to know, it doesn't exist yet in January 1777. If this flag was here, which is a big if, flags and regiments during the American Revolution is kind of a ongoing research topic. If the Army had a flag, and that's a huge if, this is the one that they would have used. The Grand Union flag is, I love this flag for a number of reasons. It's rightly the flag at the beginning of the war, because when this war begins, it's not a war of independence. It's not a war of independence for for more than a full year. And so you see in the corner there, the Union Jack, the symbol of the British Empire. And that's hearkening back to the original reasons the war was being fought, which was not for independence, but for reconciliation and the quantification of our rights as British subjects. So that's what we call the Grand Union flag. Naturally, we've declared independence. That flag's got to go. And you'll see some new flags pop up over the course of the war. Revolutionary War is great for flags.
Again, Carl asked back to the animated slides.
Mhm.
You said that the green dot houses, can they be seen from the road? And it would be cool to ask the owners to open them to the public as a fundraiser.
Well, some of them are open to the public, as it were, already. Some of them are not. Some of them are privately owned. Worth's Mill doesn't stand anymore. The Olden House you can see from the road on 206 there. It's right next to Drumthwacket, which is the governor's mansion. You can take tours of Drumthwacket. Morven, of course, doesn't make the map here, but it is just slightly off to the north of Route 206. That's here at the time of the battle, the home of Richard Stockton, some of our great friends there at Morven. William Clark's farm is no longer there. Olden's farm, David Olden's farm is no longer there. The Thomas Clark House you can see from modern-day Mercer Road, and of course we invite you to come and visit us when we're open to the public. The Quaker Meeting House is still there, and you can see it from the road. They conduct their services every Sunday. It's an active Quaker meeting. They're always looking to share their message with folks who want to come by, and I encourage checking them out as well. The two Clark houses farther down Quaker Road, the first we have there is E. Clark for Ezekiel Clark, is the Updike Farm. That's the home of the Historic Society of Princeton. So you can go and see that house as well. Farther down there is Benjamin Clark IV's farm, known as the Enos House. Today, it's private housing. So I doubt that you'll be able to get back in there. But Princeton in and of itself is a great place for seeing old buildings here. I just targeted the ones that were relevant to our story, but there are dozens of historic buildings that were around at the time of the battle that are well worth at least taking a look at from the road.
And then very quickly from Carl again, he said LD, he assumes means light dragoons.
Correct.
And what did they do during the battle?
They've got a fun story. I kind of glazed over it for the sake of time, but since you asked, Carl, the two light dragoon companies that are attached to the 4th Brigade on the British left, let's see if I can get there quickly. On the British left, they will fight dismounted. Dragoons, for those of you who don't know, are effectively light, cavalry infantry. They are meant for getting around the battlefield quickly and deploying where they can be of best use. In this moment, Mawhood deploys one company on his left dismounted and the one on the right mounted. You'll notice that in the animation, the company on the right gets way away from where they're supposed to be. And we actually have just found some cool information about that particular company and the poor folks who were involved there. More on that later. We can't say it out loud yet, but suffice to say, those folks were really, really caught out in what comes next. You see, they get nearly enveloped by the resurgence of Cadwalader and Mercer's combined brigade, and then the arrival of Mifflin's troops. There's a whole court-martial that goes along with that, and they are induced. They're sent out there mounted. But at one point, at least we hear from the court-martial, they are induced to fight, as they say, prone. They're lying down. The fire, they said, was so hot that we were induced to fight prone. Now, that's pretty rare for the American Revolution. So that's a good question there, Carl. What happened to those light dragoons? That poor young man was only about 17 years old, and he gets court-martialed for not getting out of there fast enough.
Again, he asked, in your research, did you find any references to Colonel Benjamin Flower? I believe he was the head of the artificers.
Yeah, Flower, actually, I like Flower. And I did my master's thesis on Committee of Safety Muskets, so naturally it talked about the head of the artificers and laboratories and the Board of War. Flower doesn't necessarily come in as a major character here during the Battle of Princeton, but he's obviously a major player in the American Revolution, and during this period, if I'm not mistaken, they're working on manufacturing a lot of those laboratories that are going to be a big deal during the Philadelphia campaign.
Okay, then Robert Wong asks, the William Clark House was in the middle of the battle. Has its foundation been found?
Hey, Bob. The short answer is no. The longer answer is that there's private housing up there right now. So we're not really in a position to do any serious archaeological work up there. What's important to remember about this battlefield, again, like so many other Rev War battlefields, is that they have been built on. In the 250 years since, there have been two houses on the ground on which William Clark's house used to stand, not the least of which is what's known as the Mercer Manor, which is a massive building that was built on or near the site of William Clark's farmhouse. So more on that later. And, you know, Bob, if you've got a big checkbook and you want to send something our way and purchase some property here in Princeton, we'd be more than happy to facilitate that for you.
Very cute, Will.
Thank you.
Peter Primavera asks, I believe wasn't the Olden house a witness to the structure?
It is, yeah, Thomas Olden's house, which is a little to the north there. I had it on the original map. Go back. There he is, right up next to Drumthwacket.
Carl again asks about how was the Swan collection assembled?
Well, that might be a better question for Bob. The Swan collection isn't here with us at Princeton Battlefield. It's over at Washington Crossing State Park, which I recommend you go visit. And the collection itself is I describe it as a 3D textbook, that museum. You can go in there, and I've seen people walk through that museum in 5 minutes, and shame on those people. You could spend 5 hours in there reading and seeing all of the stuff that's in Kells's collection. It is a multi-generational collection from Kells's family. And over years, generations, they've come together with one of the most, if not the most, I'll say it is the most impressive collection of Rev War artifacts that I have ever seen, and we're really looking forward to seeing how it's displayed in the new museum at Washington Crossing.
That's great. John Emmons asks, will the Clark House be open more days and hours moving forward, and how might its collections be exhibited in the future?
Well, the answer to that question is the Clark House is open Wednesday through Sunday. We're closed Monday, Tuesday, because I need a weekend. I appreciate that. As we go forward, that may change, but we're talking about something that's probably years away. The short answer is there's a lot on the table here for what the Battlefield Society, the DEP, and what the American Battlefield Trust want for this park. One of those things is the possibility of a visitor center, or at least an expanded space to store our collection from the Clark House. So in short, that would be the hope, is that sometime, within the next decade or two, we get the same luck that Washington Crossing has had, which is to say we will construct something hopefully in line with the cultural and historic landscape of our property here. We have a lot to think about as we're moving toward that decision, which includes our neighbors, both the private residences and our closeness to the Quaker meeting and the good folks who worship there and go to school there. So there are things in the works, but for now, come visit me sometime between Wednesday and Sunday, and know that just like you, I need a couple of days off for myself.
Okay, and my friend Gary Zaretsky asks, who are the local guides that you mentioned who guided Washington's troops on the back roads?
There's a handful of them. one gentleman, his name is escaping me now.
Anderson?
Anderson, that's it. Thank you. Anderson's the fellow. There's also a possibility that Aaron Burr is part of one of these guides. Those who are local will know that Burr's family has very close ties to Princeton, so he
That's a
would
stretch.
undoubtedly know his way through those back roads up towards Princeton. There's also the Scudder gets mentioned every so often as well, but Anderson is the one who makes the most common appearance.
John Rahm happens to mention about a woman by the name of Ginny Jackson.
Yeah, I've read that one.
She's from Allentown. She's from my hometown. I have a
Oh,
program on her, by the way. So
good. Well, see, there we go. We should do
we'll
program
do it in the
at the
future.
battlefield. Um,
But you know, ironically, I'm sorry, it's a roundtable. But ironically, when I moved here, I'm dealing with two women supposedly from the Revolutionary War era, and Molly Pitcher and Ginny Jackson. But I do believe at this point that Ginny Jackson had more to do, and the Molly Pitcher also had more to do with showing Alexander Hamilton or Lafayette's advance troops to the Battle of Monmouth. And that's because of my last program I gave after doing careful research there. I believe that's my latest thesis on this Molly Pitcher story from Allentown. Excuse me for butting in, but
no, not at all. There's a lot to be said about the unspoken heroes, the unsung heroes of our revolution. And so many times it's just local civilians, putting themselves and their families on the line like those women. So I'm sure it's a great program. I look forward to seeing it.
okay. Now from Bob Wong, we have. Can you elaborate on the discussion and decision by Washington at Kingston not to seize the British Treasury in New Brunswick? Who was in favor, not in favor?
That's a great question, and it's Bob's. It's going to be a good question. This is kind of, again, a debated thing, whether or not Washington is aware that the treasury is in New Brunswick. Again, glazed over it for time, but in the aftermath of the battle, Washington's army reaches Kingston over the Millstone River and burns the bridge behind them, with British light infantry from Cornwallis's army rushing back up to catch them. And Washington has this final council of war where they do ultimately decide, almost unanimously. Washington seems to be the only guy who's still interested in pushing to New Brunswick, but nearly unanimously, his subordinate officers say that this army is spent. And not only that, it's important to note that for the first time, they're taking stock of what they've lost at the battlefield. And top of that list is Mercer, among several other officers from the regimental level. So their officer corps has taken a significant hit. Whether Washington knew the chest was there or not, cannot tell you definitively. I wish I could. I'd like to think that if Washington was aware of it, he wouldn't have written his January 5th letter to Hancock the way he does. He essentially writes this follow-up letter 2 days later and intimates that if he had known, if he had two fresh brigades or three, he says if I had two fresh regiments or single fresh regiment, we could have taken Brunswick, wherein we've learned that there is a chest of about 70,000 pounds sterling. I don't know if he knew it then. Certainly New Brunswick was the major supply depot for the British operations in New Jersey. He could have expected to find food, possibly clothing, certainly powder and arms material that his army desperately needed. But I don't know if he knew about the money. If he did, we might be talking about, a different ending to the 10 crucial days. But as they say, all's well that ends well. I think Washington's staff officers were hit the nail on the head. This army had done a lot in the last 24 hours. They had fought 2 battles, marched more than 25 miles, some of them, were worn out and exhausted. With the rest of Cornwallis's army on their heels, a force of somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 men. If Washington waits for an hour to recoup, they're on him. And he's fighting another battle with, a hand and a half tied behind his back, and it's not good. So good question, Bob. It's one of
And
those
now-
great what ifs of American history.
Bob has a follow-up question. How many troops were in New Brunswick and how far back was pursuing Cornwallis?
There were only about 300 troops in New Brunswick.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were only the vast majority of the British forces were split now between New York and Cornwallis's force down in Trenton. Cornwallis's force was right behind them, right? We have these accounts with light infantry at the very least nipping at the Army's heels at Millstone, firing and burning the bridge behind them before light dragoons could come up and capture again Captain Mulder's battery. Twice in one day, Captain Joseph Mulder, 63 years old, saves the bacon of the Continental Army. The first time during the British advance at Battle of Princeton, and the second time that the Americans moving away from town, they saved their bacon at Kingston. Cool guy, Mulder. Yeah, they were right on them, Bob. So this is a split moment decision, and fortunately for us, again, all's well that ends well. Washington moves to the north towards Morristown.
Yeah. Well, do you know, John Emmons is asking, the derelict houses adjacent to the battlefield, will they be acquired?
You're talking about the ones on Mercer Road?
He doesn't, it's not specific.
Not specific. There are two houses on Mercer Road which are falling apart. Those are already owned by the state, actually, and we are in the process of getting them demoed and adding that property to the battlefield park. Our goal is, preserving all of the battlefield land that we can. So if something becomes available, we do typically try to run it through Green Acres to see if we can acquire that property. But again, if you've got a nice big checkbook.
Carl asks, how do you use volunteers? You have the Friends group.
We sure do, yeah. So we have two sources for volunteers. You can work with the Princeton Battlefield Society. They do a number of programs every year. This past Sunday, literally yesterday, we had one of our largest Young Patriots days to date. And we can always use volunteers, of course, for our reenactment, our annual reenactment. On the state side, I'm developing a small corps of volunteers as well. We do those volunteers do living history interpretation, and they act as docents in the house, doing house tours, and basically acting as an extension of myself and my coworkers when we get too busy doing other things. So yeah, if you're interested in volunteering, shoot us an email, give us a call.
Peter asks, is the Princeton-Trenton trolley line in the restoration area?
It is not. Great question. The trolley line rides just south of the border of the park. You can walk that trail. It belongs to the Institute for Advanced Study. It's part of what's called the Institute Woods. For you Oppenheimer fans out there, he's responsible for a lot of the maintenance and the creation of that space. Or for you not Oppenheimer fans. But the trolley line trail, that old Princeton trolley trail, yeah, it's not on our property. We do like to interpret it when we talk about the development of the area in the house, but for the moment, there's not too much we can do about it.
Yeah, this is a big question for you, Will, but John Emmons asks, will there be an effort to interpret the 10 crucial days as a campaign with the satellite sites in Lawrence, etc., similar to Richmond National Battlefield Park?
That's actually already ongoing. We have Roger Williams' 10crucialdays.org organization. They do with Washington Crossing Historical Park in PA, Washington Crossing NJ, the old barracks in Trenton, and the battlefield here. Basically it's a historian's dream. It's an all-day bus tour of all of the 10 Crucial Days sites. We're developing that further for school tours just between the sites. And there exists a handful of audio tours which you can take. I think Travel Stories is the one that they came out with during the pandemic that allows you to visit all of these sites. The farther and closer we get to the 250th, the more these sites get to work together. My colleagues at Washington Crossing State Park, at Washington Crossing Historical Park, and at the barracks are the best people in the world. They love this period. They love teaching and interpreting history on every level. And I think every single one of us would be in agreement when we say we're actively moving toward a collective interpretation of the 10 crucial days, and always pushing visitors who haven't visited one site or another to see them too.
That's great. Carl states that in his thesis research that Flowers claimed that Knox gave him command of the artillery. There was a major falling out between them. I guess he's asking you to comment.
Oh, is that during Princeton? I don't know if I've ever seen that.
Okay. The next one is from Kim Gallagher. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Kim.
The Clark Road seems new. How did its presence and layout get discovered?
That's a great question, Kim. It's one of those things, and Kim's a member of the Battlefield Society, and also a partner at Morven. So he knows this area. So this is good and a great question. The Clark Lane is not necessarily a new discovery, but it's an additive discovery. We knew it was there. We have evidence of it. Actually, one of the existing trails in the park is the archaeological trace of that lane. You can go back all the way to the earliest historical aerial photographs we have of the field back in the 30s, and you see it clear as day. And just recently, we discovered it in a series of old photographs going all the way back to the mid 19th century. Thought I saw Paul Larson on the call here earlier, but I believe it was Paul who showed me that photograph very clearly of this road as it would have run just to the north of the meeting house. That lane is a naturally in the right place. Clark, his brother William, even the Olden family looking for access to the Stony Brook or to Quaker Road, naturally to the meeting house, would have taken this little lane right in front of the Clark house. If you visit us, you can again see the archaeological trace of that lane. So it is a new in the sense that for the first time I've seen a map of it, which I had, let's see, there it is on the right. That map is hand drawn by a man named Henry Ewing Hale Jr. Henry Ewing Hale lives in the Thomas Clark house after the Clark family. He's there with his father from 1862 until the 1940s. His family resides there, his father and himself and his children. He hand draws that map. So he's got there, you can see the path of the main column, that's the Sawmill Road. And then this hand-drawn two roads marked by the B and C there. That's the Clark Lane. And then the one going all the way up to what's William Clark's house there is an additional lane. Now, Henry Ewing Hale did this when he was an adult and drew them, in his own words, as I recalled it from my youth. So this map comes to us about 80 years after the Battle of Princeton, from the recollections of a young man remembering from his childhood what the layout of the farm was. Again, only a few decades removed from the Clark family owning it. So this Clark Lane adds a new piece of information for us here at Princeton Battlefield and changes our interpretation of the troop movements, mainly because it gives Captain Thomas Rodney's account of a middle road considerable credit. For the longest time, we were wondering what Rodney was on about, if he was misremembering something. But here it is, a middle road between the Sawmill Road and the King's Highway, leading to Princeton. Great question, Kim.
Peter Primavera asks, will the National Register boundaries change as a result of the recent research and IAS settlement?
That's a great question. The IAS property is already in two existing National Historic Registries, the Institute for Advanced Studies and the Stony Brook region. So I'd have to look at a map to see specifically if we're going to have to adjust it, but I don't think we are. If we were to get, say, $15 billion worth of property between here and Princeton University, yeah, we'd be talking about a serious change. But for the moment, I think all of the property that's been recently acquired exists within the bounds of what's already been identified. That's a really good question.
Carl asks, is there a management plan available?
Yes, there is. There are two, in fact. There's plenty to see. We have the preservation plan, which was done in 2010, which talks about the grounds to some extent, but mostly focuses on the Clark House and the extant structures, as well as a handful of other reports. The Milner report, which was done in 2008, 2009, also called sometimes the mapping project, might be the one you're looking for, Carl. If you just go to Google and you type in Battle of Princeton mapping project, the first thing that will come up is a link to the Princeton Battlefield Society's webpage and a PDF of that plan. Go ahead and take a look at that. And if not, shoot me an email. I've got about a stack this high of other management plans and other plans for the park.
Carl's follow-up question is, were the dead buried on site?
Good question. This battle takes place in about 24 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 3rd, 1777. So the ground, you may imagine, is frozen solid. The grim task of burying the dead is one of those great, interesting pieces about the American Revolution that we so rarely get to hear about. I've seen Dr. Selvig do a talk about burying the dead. In the American Revolution, and he mentions Princeton in particular, and the research that he's done regarding the burial of the dead at Princeton. Obviously, the big question that everybody wants for our battlefield is where is the mass grave, right? There's a mass grave behind the colonnade here at the park. Well, it's up there somewhere, allegedly. Again, this is the issue with secondary and tertiary source information. As the story goes, from excuse me, descendants of the Clark family, there are 37 bodies buried up there on the top of the hill, British and American, buried in a limestone quarry, and then later filled in when spring came. The dead stretch from the Clark farm all the way into Princeton, and primary accounts have us putting the dead into whatever open hole was already available, and that's British redoubts that were already dug in and around town, ditches along the side of the road. These men were either buried there when spring came or reburied in various other locations. The Quaker Friends meeting had a story where there were a number of soldiers buried there. We've recently kind of debunked that. There were 3 former Quakers who had been written out of their faith for joining the Continental Army. They were part of the Philadelphia Associated Brigade, who were briefly buried in the Quaker cemetery, but they were exhumed and taken back home to Philadelphia so they could be buried in their own plot. Yeah, there are a handful of stories where, you know, in some of the nearby churches in Lawrence, that there are soldiers from the battle buried there. I haven't found any primary source information saying definitively that, but what I can tell you is burying the dead was hard after the Battle of Princeton. The ground was difficult to work with, and a lot of these guys lay out exposed to the elements until the ground was soft enough to cover them.
Right. Peter Primavera asks, is there any truth to the saying that the former White Farm on the other side of the Stony Brook was considered part of the battlefield?
I'm not sure if there's anything to be said about that. That property there is partially owned by Benjamin Clark and partially owned by Thomas Clark and James Clark. So, I mean, an argument could be made that up at the northern part of that property is where the British turned around and looked into the sun and saw American troops. So, you know, if again, if you got a big checkbook, we could theoretically add it to the park, but it's somewhat separated from the park as a total. I'm not sure there's too much interest in acquiring that property. There exists an overlook park near there, and I say park very gently. And of course, you can't see anything because there's trees everywhere, so it doesn't really give you an idea of what the British saw on the morning of the 3rd. But yeah, for the moment, our goal is contiguous property. If it's, you know, next to the battlefield, we're going to try and acquire it.
From what appears to be a relative of yours, Will.
Yep.
Randy.
That's my dad.
Okay, for the group gathered tonight, it seems these 10 days were more a turning point in the war, more than Saratoga, which was my back in the day history book, the turning point. And given the renewed enthusiasm of the troops and colonists in general over Trenton and Princeton, would that be so?
Well, good question. I like to say there are no turning points of the war. Every single historian from every single park will tell you that theirs is the turning point of the war. In fact, I recently visited Saratoga, and as part of their video, they say this is the turning point of the war. Everyone, believes that their area of study has the utmost amount of importance, as well they should, because every single one of these moments deserves to be considered a turning point, and in some ways, they are. What I like to say, for Saratoga is that Saratoga doesn't happen without Princeton. A lot doesn't happen without Trenton and Princeton. The 10 Crucial Days is the game-saving Hail Mary of the American Revolution. This is an audacious and unbelievably lucky campaign for General Washington. The one argument that I will make is that I see other Revolutionary War sites say this is the darkest hour of the American Revolution. On this hill I will die. This is the darkest hour of the American Revolution. We are one battle away from becoming a footnote in the history of the British Empire. And we win. History changes because of what happens here at Trenton and Princeton. Is it the turning point of the war? I don't know. You'd have to ask the folks who've spent the next 6.5 years fighting the rest of it. They probably wouldn't agree with you. This is a long war with a lot of fighting in it to still be done. But yeah, you can't understate the importance of these 10 days. Everything that follows because of them. Again, right? That great Nicholas Creswell quote, "They have all gone liberty mad again." He's not talking about just the soldiery. He's talking about the people in the United States. They have gone liberty mad again. And I'll give Howe credit where credit is due. General William Howe knew that the only way the British were going to win this war was if the people of the United States believed that being the United States wasn't worth the trouble, that being colonists of Great Britain was a better, more appealing option. And Trenton and Princeton changed that forever. Howe tells us himself that the only way we can win the war now is by destroying them outright.
Really. Peter Avioli asked, is it true that the Continental Cannonball hit the portrait of King George III inside Nassau Hall?
I love that story. There are so many accounts of the barrage of Nassau Hall that I couldn't tell you what is true and what isn't. What I will tell you is this. In the inventory done by the board of the College Board of the College of New Jersey in the immediate aftermath of the battle, it is mentioned that the portrait of King George II, it's not George III, it's George II, who charters the school, is damaged. And that's the extent of what we have regarding that portrait. It's a great story, made all the better by the fact that accompanying the story is the tale of the young gentleman who fired that gun was Alexander Hamilton, who, if you've seen the musical or you know your Hamilton history, you'll know he was denied entry to the College of New Jersey on an expedited academic course in the lead up to the American Revolution. So what I can say for you is this. There was a portrait of King George II, and it was indeed damaged. Was it damaged by a cannonball taking his head off? Who's to say? One of those great stories of the American Revolution. That's just that, a great story.
Our friend Joe Robolaski asked about the Greek column or the Grecian columns on the western side of the Mercer Pike. What's the story?
The colonnade was originally designed in the mid-19th century by famed United States architect Thomas Ustick Walter. Those of you may recognize that name. He's one of the 4 architects of the United States Capitol building. Chiefly, he designed and executed the construction of the dome of the building. So if you like the rotunda, you've got Thomas Ustick Walter to thank. He designed this house for a man named Matthew Newkirk in Philadelphia, famed philanthropist, entrepreneur. Newkirk, the home burns down at the end of the 19th century. A wealthy family living in Princeton purchased the columns, which had survived the fire, cut them into pieces, put them on a barge up the Delaware River, onto the DNR Canal, up to the Kingston Lock, and down Nassau Street and Mercer Street on horse and wagon, and placed them in front of their new mansion, aptly named the Mercer Manor. It stood near the site of William Clark's former farmhouse on the battlefield. By the end of the 1930s, the Mercer Manor burned down. Not great. Not a great look for the columns, but the columns survived. Again, by the 1950s, the Institute for Advanced Study had acquired the property on which the remains of the manor stood with the columns, and very nicely donated them to the state of New Jersey, saying that these columns were designed by famed architect Thomas Ustick Walter. Would you like them? And we said yes. We moved them appropriately to the top of that hill, where you may recall I answered earlier. The story was that's where the mass grave was. So the colonnade stands as what we call the portico, the entrance to this grave site. It is a place of memory and memorial. We do every year our memorial service after the reenactment up there at the colonnade.
Well, I think at this point, we're going to see, maybe we can take one more question. I've got a couple of comments.
Okay.
And we'll give everybody an opportunity to unmute and thank Will for his excellent presentation today.
Okay, this last one's a long one, Will.
Okay.
Kathleen Mazzacco. I grew up in Lawrence Township on a street directly off 206. When I was a child, my mother used to take us to Cadwalader Park in Trenton.
Hmm.
They had a zoo there with cages of black bears. I'm a member of DAR, and my Patriot was in the Continental Line and was part of the delay skirmish to slow the British down from reaching Trenton.
Mhm.
He was part of John Sullivan's regiment during the scorched earth policy of the Indians in northern New York. Sullivan is buried in the cemetery of the church on Route 206 in Lawrenceville. John Sullivan?
John Sullivan, the commanding officer, is that who she's asking about, or is that the name of her ancestor?
No, well, maybe, yeah. It's more likely he's buried there, and
Yeah, I don't
he's-
think General Sullivan is buried in New Jersey.
no, I believe he's from New York.
Yeah.
Okay, that's about it then. Thank
Um,
you, guys.
What I'll say is I'll put in the chat before we're done my work email, and if anyone has any questions that didn't get answered today, feel free to either email them to me, or again, you can come visit the park Wednesday through Sunday and get this has been the Reader's Digest version of what we do at the park. We can do a real deep dive there if you come and visit us. So again, I'll put my email in the chat, and thanks for the great questions.
So I'm going to ask Will, if you would take your PowerPoint down. I'm going to share just some information about our upcoming programs with folks here. Just give me a second, and then I'm going to ask everybody who would like to say thank you to Will to, there we go, share.
Thank you, Will. Very well done. Excellent.
So you're able to hear these. So we have a couple of upcoming topics. We meet quarterly. In December 9th, Gary Eckelbarger, whose book on Washington's thinking during the Philadelphia campaign just came out a couple months ago. He's going to be talking with us about Valley Forge, and they asks the question, did the Phoenix rise from the ashes at Valley Forge? Should be a very interesting talk. Hope you can join us. And then in March, we're going to hear from Alan Pell Crawford about his book, This Fierce People, about the untold story of America's war in the South. Well, that'll be interesting to hear. So, and we've also got other speakers lined up coming up in the future.
When I download a game full of ads, can't offline, need to pay.
On those words,
Whatever that was. Hey, so anybody who would like to unmute and I'm just trying to find my stuff here. I think you can just unmute yourself. I believe.
Yeah, you can, Bob.
So we just want to say thank you very much to Will for really a great presentation.
It's
Hey,
my pleasure.
I'll step up. It's Peter Primavera. Will, absolutely fabulous.
Thanks, Peter.
Absolutely fabulous. I've been working on, yeah, as you know, I've done, I think, 6 archaeological projects around the west side of Princeton, all of them touching the battlefield, and we're part of the early reconstruction. And then we did the study on the White Farm. I am so thrilled at what you've done and how you presented it tonight. I can't say enough.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for your efforts with the battlefield. It's, not just my research, but the research that a ton of people have done long before me. Who kind of set the stage for this new push toward, reimagining what the battle looked like, and acquiring this property. So thank you as well to not just Peter, but anybody on here who's had a hand in promoting the history of this region.
Hey, I'll just let you know that if you're in the Philadelphia area, on September the 24th, I'm going to be giving a talk about the Battle of Edge Hill to the American Revolution Roundtable of Philadelphia. So if you're interested in hearing about that and you're in the area, it's a face-to-face meeting. Please stop by. I'd like to say one other thing too, and that is that the Swan Historical Foundation, in addition to its excellent collection at Washington Crossing State Park, also provides scholarships and fellowships over the years for scholars interested in the period of the American Revolution. And one of our great selections was Will Krakower a few years ago. But thanks once again, Will. Thanks. Really.
There you go. Your action at work.